From Anderson Silva, who returned as a champion after a catastrophic leg injury that almost ended his career, to Chris Weidman, who defied all odds and made a triumphant return after a devastating neck injury. Here are all the remarkable UFC fighters who miraculously overcame their injuries and returned to the octagon, stronger than ever. Let's start with Jon Jones. The American MMA professional is considered one of the greatest fighters in the history of the sport, but he definitely had to overcome nearly career-ending injuries to make it to the top. Jones suffered a gruesome injury during his first-round technical knockout victory over Chael Sonnen in the main event of UFC 159. He snapped his big toe while planting his foot in an attempt to take down his opponent. Back then, he thought he had only mangled his toe, but his adrenaline was so high that he couldn't fully realize the extent of his injury, until UFC commentator Joe Rogan pointed it out in an interview after the fight. This raised some pretty serious concerns about his future in the UFC, and he had to take a few months off. But the American fighter returned stronger than ever 5 months later at UFC 165. He went on to beat Alexander Gustafsson via unanimous decision. The UFC light heavyweight champion has numerous wins over top-level fighters and MMA legends, like Lyoto Machida, Rampage Jackson, and Daniel Cormier. He's insanely amazing at what he does. But Jon Jones is hardly the only UFC fighter who faced a potentially career-ending injury and survived. Let's not forget about Dominick Cruz. The former bantamweight champion of the UFC had to take 2 whole years off due to a torn ACL. He returned to the octagon to fight again in 2014, only to once again tear his ACL during a training camp ahead of UFC 169. He was undeterred though. The American mixed martial artist underwent another surgery, as well as the rehabilitation process, and returned, finally in 2016. Known as the Dominator, Cruz defeated TJ Dillashaw and regained his title. Dominick's longest layoff was after he lost his title to Cody Garbrandt at UFC 207. Cruz sustained a ton of damage to his subscapularis and supraspinatus, which sent him on a 4-year-long hiatus. Yikes! But Cruz wasn't one to back down. No, he returned to the ring in 2020, although he ended up losing the fight to Henry Cejudo at UFC 249. Either way, his return to the UFC after the battalion of injuries that he's had to face is nothing short of amazing. But he's not the only one who exhibited such courage in the face of adversity. There was also Brock Lesnar. Brock was one of the biggest names in the wrestling circuit when the UFC recruited him. He was known as the Beast Incarnate because of his incredible size and ferocious fighting style. He went on to prove his worth by earning the title of UFC heavyweight champion after beating Randy Couture. However, just ahead of his second title defense against Shane Carwin, Brock was diagnosed with a condition known as diverticulitis. This had a significant impact on his career in the mixed martial arts and was forced to withdraw from the fight with Carwin. He first experienced the symptoms of this condition after his victory over Frank Mir at UFC 100. Diverticulitis causes inflammation and infection in the digestive tract, which can be quite painful and almost debilitating. Brock had to undergo surgery in North Dakota to have a part of his colon removed. He recovered from the surgery and returned to the ring in 2010 to face Cain Velasquez. But that didn't turn out to be a great fight, and Lesnar was defeated by Cain. Soon after that, he faced yet another bout of diverticulitis, which was way too much for Brock to handle, and he retired from the sport. The good thing was that before he retired, he beat Shane Carwin at UFC 116, and later he went on to return to professional wrestling, where he continued to perform until 2020. His life-threatening condition was definitely a setback for Lesnar, but to this day he remains one of the most dominant fighters that the UFC has ever seen. Not unlike Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira, Antonio will go down in the history of the UFC for being on the receiving end of one of the worst mixed martial arts injuries of all time. In his rematch against Frank Mir at UFC 140, Antonio had his arm snapped in two with a Kimura submission. Ouch! That sounds pretty painful, I won't lie. The Brazilian MMA fighter was winning the fight with his underrated but excellent striking game, but he decided to surprisingly go for a submission finish. This did not pan out for him. After an unsuccessful guillotine attempt from Antonio, Frank mounted a furious comeback, which ended up breaking the Big Nog's arm quite painfully. Minotauro even required a surgery, but ended up coming back only a year later at UFC 153 to defeat Dave Herman with a second-round submission. There's no one doing it quite like Antonio Nogueira. The list of UFC fighters who have overcome their shattering injuries runs pretty long, but the most important name on that list is Anderson Silva. I mean, who hasn't heard of this MMA legend? Chris Weidman's injury at UFC 261 was kind of ironic, because it bore a striking resemblance to an injury he caused Silva. So, what happened? Well, Chris captured the UFC middleweight title and went on his first title defense at UFC 168 against none other than the UFC icon, Anderson the Spider Silva. This fight would end tragically early, as Chris threw a checked leg kick at Silva just a minute into the bout, which sent him crashing to the canvas in pain and agony. Anderson broke his leg and had to go through a long and cumbersome healing process before he could return to the octagon. It took a grand total of 2 years, believe it or not, but once he came back, he proved his worth in the promotion by defeating some of the greatest fighters of all time. Speaking of Chris Weidman, he also went through his fair share of potentially career-ending injuries as well. He suffered a serious neck injury during his fight with Kelvin Gastelum at UFC Long Island in 2017. He ended up having a herniated disc in his neck during the fight, which needed surgery to repair. This injury, as well as the surgery he underwent, caused him to miss over a year of fighting. He eventually returned to the UFC in 2018, where he went on to defeat Kelvin Gastelum by unanimous decision. His recovery from the injury was a long and challenging process though, and worked pretty hard to regain his strength as well as his conditioning. To his fans' relief, he was able to come back to his MMA career. But things went south once again at UFC 261 in 2021, where Weidman suffered a broken leg. This once again required a painfully long recovery period. What happened was that during a fight with Uriah Hall, he attempted a leg kick pretty early in the first round. When his leg connected with Uriah's shin, Chris's lower leg pretty much snapped in half, causing a brutal injury. Weidman then had to undergo surgery to repair the fracture and had to have a titanium rod placed inside his leg. Not gonna lie, this injury was a pretty severe one, and many believed that it could end his career. Chris, on the other hand, was determined to make it back to the octagon. He began an intense rehabilitation program to regain his strength and moves, and hopes to have a fight scheduled pretty soon. Anyway, that's everything on the UFC fighters who overcame their almost career-ending injuries. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.